Welcome back, everyone. Now that lunch is unpostponed. Let's start with our afternoon agenda items. Chub mackerel specifications. We're going to review the previously set 2025 specifications for Atlantic chub mackerel and consider if revisions are needed. Julia, are you ready?
I am.
All right. It's all yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Stephen, you can go to the next slide. So for this presentation, I'm going to review the management history for chub mackerel, recent fishery performance. I'll summarize the AP fishery performance report and the SSC recommendation. And then it'll be up to the council to consider if changes are needed to the previously adopted 2025 specifications. And staff, the AP, and the SSC all recommend no changes. Next slide. So as a reminder, the first management measures for chub mackerel in this part of the world were implemented through the Unmanaged Forage Omnibus Amendment, and those measures became effective in September of 2017, and they were intended to be temporary management measures to give the council more time to develop what became Amendment 21 to the Mackerel Squid Butterfish FMP, which added chub mackerel to that FMP, meeting all the Magnuson Act requirements for a stock in need of conservation and management. That amendment became effective in September of 2020, and that amendment implemented all of the management measures that we currently have for chub mackerel, and they've all been unchanged since that time. So that amendment established things like the ABC, ACLs, et cetera, and everything else listed on the slide here, which I'm not going to read it all, but you can see on the slide here the types of measures that are in place for chub mackerel. Next slide. So the ABC has been unchanged since 2020. It's been the same 2,300 metric tons or about 5.07 million pounds each year. When the SSC first adopted this ABC, they agreed that insufficient information exists to assess the status and trends of this stock in this part of the world. Therefore, an OFL cannot be specified, and the ABC was set based on their expert judgment. And the ABC is based loosely on the historic high for landings and assumptions about discards. It prevents the fishery from reaching the historic high for landings, but allows higher landings than in all other years. And the SSC agreed that this level of an ABC is unlikely to result in overfishing, given the general productivity of this species worldwide and low fishery capacity in this region. And they've reviewed this ABC every year for the past several years, and they've always recommended no changes, including most recently last month. They agree that this ABC should stay in place for 2025. Next slide. So next I'm going to walk through how we get from the ABC to all the other catch and landings limits that we use for chub mackerel. So chub mackerel is a little bit unique in that the SSC agreed that the ABC should apply to the whole East Coast from Maine through Florida, just given what we know about the distribution of the stock. But the council decided not to implement any other management measures that would apply to the South Atlantic. So the way that we make that work is, if you could click next, Stephen, we subtract a value of expected South Atlantic catch, next, to get to the annual catch limit, or ACL. And then if you could click next 2 more times, we subtract a 4% buffer for management uncertainty to get to the annual catch target. And then if you click next 2 more times, we subtract a 6% buffer from that to account for expected dead discards to get to a total allowable landings limit of 4.5 million pounds. And everything here, it's combined commercial and recreational. There's no separate catch and landings limits for commercial and recreational. So 4.5 million pounds total allowable landings limit has been in place since 2020. And then the next slide shows how landings have compared to that TAL, which is in red, for the years that it was in place, or that it has been in place, through 2023, the most recent complete year. And you can see that the combined commercial and recreational landings have been well below that every year that it's been in place. And the only time that landings came close to that, or that reached that, was in 2013. But since that time, landings have been a lot lower. Next slide. It's a similar situation for the ABC. Again, the ABC has only been in place since 2020. And so this is showing estimates of overall commercial and recreational catch. The commercial discard estimates are coming from CAMs. And then for the recreational side of things, there was an assumption made about translating recreational discards in numbers of fish to discards in weight. So I just want to note that these catch numbers are not like the official GARFO estimates for quota monitoring for comparing to the ACL. These are, in some cases, some assumptions were made, but I think the main takeaway message stands that catch has been well below the ABC in all of the years that the ABC has been in place. And then next slide. So next I'm going to describe a little bit more about the commercial and recreational fisheries, and this helps to explain why landings have been so far below their limits in recent years, especially in terms of the commercial fishery. The years with the high chub mackerel landings, especially 2013, the vessels that were responsible for most of those landings were also vessels that participate in the Illex squid fishery. And they were harvesting chub mackerel at the same time of year in some of the same places where they also harvest Illex squid. And 2013, that peak chub mackerel year, was a year where those captains said that there wasn't a lot of Illex around, but there was a lot of chub mackerel. And that was a time when some of the dealers had worked to gain access to chub mackerel markets. And so it just kind of worked out that all these factors aligned such that they targeted chub mackerel. It was useful for them to do that in a time when they weren't able to target Illex, but if they could have targeted Illex, they would prefer, to focus on Illex or another species. But chub mackerel is more of like an alternative species in that sense. So similarly, most of those landings are from fewer than 5 vessels and fewer than 3 dealers. So depending on how you break down the data, we might get into situations of confidential data. So we have to combine some years in some of our reporting to do with the confidential data. Almost all the landings are coming from bottom trawls and about 5% from midwater trawls, according to federal VTRs. The commercial fishery is generally taking place from summer through early fall, and the price per pound can vary over time, which you can see in the fishery information document, but on average over the past 20 years, it's been about 57 cents per pound adjusted to 2023 dollars. Next slide. This figure is basically the same as what I've shown in the past several years. It's just showing where most of the chub mackerel landings came from when those landings were aggregated across the past 20 years. You can see most of the landings are coming from statistical areas 622 and 626 in the dark blue. Next slide. This is this year's quota monitoring report. So you can see the trajectory of 2024 landings in blue and 2023 landings in yellow. And the green line is if landings were evenly spread throughout the year, they would follow that trajectory to meet the 90% of the total allowable landings limit, which is when a different possession limit kicks into place as a kind of an in-season accountability measure. But you can see that landings this year and last year have not followed that line at all, and they look like they're almost zero. There are some landings there, just the scale of the graph makes it look like it's essentially zero. But take-home message here is that so far the trajectory of this year's landings is similar to prior years, where landings are very low and well below the total allowable landings limit. Next slide. So this is showing the recreational catch according to the MRIP data. This is harvest in yellow and discards in teal, both in numbers of fish. And I added the asterisks for places where there were high PSEs. So this is combining Maine through North Carolina at the annual level. So I thought it was interesting that there were still these examples of high PSEs, because when there's high PSEs, you're supposed to aggregate your data, and this is already highly aggregated. So there's definitely some uncertainty and variability in the MRIP data, but we still see a pretty strong difference in, say, 2018 to 2023 compared to earlier years, where there's higher recreational catch in these recent years. Some of this we've talked about in previous years, that the MRIP, the program for MRIP, when they train their APIS samplers, they have a core list of species that they train the MRIP samplers to identify. And they added chub mackerel to that list of core species at some point in time. So that corresponds with this increase. So we think maybe there's some improved reporting. The council also sent out a species identification guide to a lot of permit holders and some other folks that got the ID guides out into the hands of fishermen. So maybe there's improved reporting. I'm not sure if there's increased availability or if there's changes in targeting or changes in fishing practices that would have influenced this. And one thing to note is that the mackerel, squid, butterfish AP doesn't have people who can speak to the recreational side of this fishery. So we don't have some of our explanations for this trend are just kind of things that might make logical sense, but we don't have a ton of input from people who are actually recreationally fishing for chub mackerel in terms of, is it just improved reporting or is it also changes in availability or changes in fishing behavior? Next slide. A little bit more information on where the recreational catch is coming from. On average, over the past 5 years, about 57% of the harvest came from state waters and 43% from federal waters. Most of the harvest was coming from Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. It was about 53% private rental, 32% private charter, and 15% from shore. Next slide. So we took all this information to the advisory panel and asked them the typical fishery performance report questions. They didn't have a lot to say. Key points from the AP was that they thought that no changes were needed to any of the specifications for 2025. They didn't recommend any changes to the research priorities, and they reiterated that, as with other recent prior years, that chub mackerel are not being targeted by commercial fishermen recently. So that's why we see such low landings, that the commercial fishermen are focusing on other things. Next slide. So in addition to the SSC recommending no change in the ABC for 2025, they also had some additional discussion about the possibility to get more information on chub mackerel in terms of a better understanding of stock status. And they noted that next year we'll be looking at setting a new round of 3-year specifications as opposed to just reviewing specifications for chub mackerel. So when we set a new round of specifications, they could still be set equal to what they were before, but it could be a good opportunity to try to see if we can get more information to help inform those specifications. So the SSC thought it might be useful to do a feasibility study for conducting an assessment in the future. They also talked about how the council several years ago put out an RFP for something along the lines of a chub mackerel stock assessment. And at that time, the council decided not to fund any proposals because there was concern that chub mackerel was so data poor that even existing data poor approaches might be challenging. So the SSC talked about that, and they noted that there are some biological samples and growth information available. So there was a paper on growth rates of chub mackerel that came out a few years ago. And there's also some new methods, such as a method with the acronym LIME, which stands for Length-Based Integrated Mixed Effects. And there's a paper related to that that's referenced in the SSC report. And so they thought some of this new information, these new studies, that it might be worth revisiting this idea of doing some sort of analysis to help us get at chub mackerel stock status. Next slide. So that's basically it. They didn't recommend any changes for 2025, but again, those recommendations for further analysis were more looking towards next year. So the discussion before the council today is, do you think any revisions are needed to the previously, this should say 2025 specifications, not just the ABC. Didn't update this slide since the SSC meeting. So the staff, the AP, and the SSC recommend no changes to any of the specifications for chub mackerel for 2025. I will note that the monitoring committee, we over email provided them the information and asked if they saw a need to discuss it, and they said, there's no need to for the monitoring committee to hold a meeting to talk about Chub Mackerel because the information was all similar to prior years, so they didn't see any issues. So overall, the recommendation is for no changes to the 2025 specifications that were previously adopted. And if the council agrees with that, then we don't need a motion to maintain those existing specifications. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments? Ask Julia. Adam?
Is there anything to suggest from an AP performance report, from anything in management, that management action has had any effect on catch or landings of this species?
Julia?
I'd say no, we don't have any indication that management has impacted anything, because you can see in the prior slides that all the management measures were set at such a high level that they haven't impacted things in recent years because the main players have been focusing on other species. And I have heard some comments that didn't come through in this year's fishery performance report, but we have heard that the commercial industry, especially, those few players that were involved in, say, 2013 when there were higher landings, that they do think it's still useful to have Chub Mackerel as an option for them. So there's still the potential that there could be these periodic higher landings, but that hasn't been the case in recent years. So we don't have any indication that the management measures are constraining the fishery right now, and it's more other factors such as the market.
Adam?
So given that answer, I'll make two comments. Comment number one is that my experience in the recreational side is that trend in landings is not a change in landings. It is purely a reporting aspect. I can speak personally, as well as for a large portion of the for-hire sector, that prior to Chub Mackerel getting some notice here through action in this council, we didn't know what it was. We just went ahead and marked mackerel down when we'd catch them in the summertime recreationally. And I can speak that way for a lot of other people. Beyond that, my other comment would be, while I appreciate the comments of the ideas for further work, I would recommend the minimum amount of work this council does on this species and focus on other more pressing needs as we continue to move forward. Thank you.
Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, and I guess, speaking of other work, I'm assuming Adam was maybe referring to the feasibility study that the SSC noticed, and that was just going to be my question. Julia, was the SSC suggesting that at some point in the future, perhaps a subgroup of their membership would conduct this, or was this suggested as, a potential future examination that might be conducted by a contractor or something?
I'm not sure that they really had that specific level of a discussion at the council meeting, or at the SSC meeting. And one particular SSC member who suggested it, he had some email exchanges with me after the fact about what data are available to help think about if it's possible. And I don't know that we've gotten much in the way of clarity on that yet, but I kind of got the impression that it was more of like, it would be good to do as a separate contract, but I don't know that they necessarily had that discussion. That was more of just the impression that I got. And I will also note that there was some SSC members who also said similar things along the lines of what Adam said, that like, yeah, that would be useful, but is it the most pressing thing? So there was some kind of split opinions among the SSC too.
Any more comments around the table? Paul Rego? If you're speaking, we can't hear you, Paul. It's on your end, according to Stephen, so you were fine yesterday. All right, I'm gonna move on to Jeff Kalen, then we'll come back to you. Jeff Kalen?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the council. Good afternoon, it's Jeff from Lunds. On the last issue that was just mentioned, I believe, I think Julie and I talked about this a little bit the other day, if I'm correct. I think Olaf had contacted me. You know, a few years ago, we did have some catches, and Dr. Leaf from the University of Southern Mississippi had a data collection program, and there were some samples that were taken. And I think Dr. Jensen was thinking that there could be enough data there to run a model. This would probably be a Science Center for Marine Fisheries project, not anything that would take up council or agency resources, other than the fact that the Science Center is a member of SEMFISH. So I think that's what's being discussed. And, you know, we meet again in the fall. And if the determination is that there is enough data from the samples that were taken to try to run a model that Olaf has in mind, that's something that we might undertake as an industry funded project later this year. So that's what I know about this particular issue. Thank you.
Paul, do you want to try again? All right, still no Paul. Any more comments or questions around the table? All right. Are there going to be any recommended changes to anything, even though the SSC does not recommend any? Seeing none, no action needs to be taken. Thank you, Julia. We're going to come back to you in a little bit. Let's move on to Longfin Squid specifications. Jason didn't. Council will review previously adopted 2025 specs for the squids, which will maintain the status quo from 2024. Jason, are you ready?
Yes, Stephen, I just tried to share my screen. Okay, that might do it now. Thank you. Okay, do you see my presentation in full screen mode now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. We're reviewing 2025 Longfin Squid specifications. Council previously set Longfin Squid specifications for 24, 25, and 26. Going to do some background, review the AP input, staff ABC recommendation, and then SSC recommendation. So some management background. Is one of our earliest FMPs. There's a limited access directed tier 1 primary fishery. There's about 230 of those tier 1 permits on vessels in 2023. They have no trip limits initially when the fishery is open. There are some gear requirements, 2 1/8-inch mesh in September through April, and then 1 7/8-inch May through August in the summer. So the other tiers have lower trip limits, and there's also a 250-pound trip limit for just kind of total open access incidental permits. So there's about 399 longfin kind of rights in the NIMS permit system total between the three, and about 100 of those are in confirmation of permit history, or CPH, otherwise kind of known as on-the-shelf permits. There's seasonal management with this fishery. The quota split in to 3 trimesters. Trimester 1 is January through April, 2 May through August, 3 September through December. The percentages are up that for trimester 2, which is May through August, it starts at 17%. There's some rollover allowed from trimester 1 to 2, up to 1.5 times the original. And then there's full rollover into trimester 3. So any underages and overages are just kind of rolled over, and trimester 3 just works on the full quota, essentially. For trimester 1 and 3 closures, it's a 2,500 pound trip limit once those trimester quotas are met. Trimester 2 is a 250 pound trip limit because trimester 2 is more inshore, and we saw in some years past that at a 2,500 pound trip limit, we could still get a good bit of directing. So a number of years ago, the council lowered that trimester 2 closure trip limit. So the specifications we're at now, I think we're pending a final rule. There's a proposed rule. The final rule for this is not quite published, but it's not very different from previously. But we have a 23,400 metric ton ABC. About 2% is set aside for discards, leaving a little under 23,000 metric tons as our initial optimum yield. It's our quota. So about 50.5 million pounds. And that came from a year in the past that appeared to have kind of the highest catch to biomass ratio in an old assessment. That number has actually changed now due to some revised discards, but the SSC and staff had recommended too, just to kind of leave that alone at 23,400. We have a new assessment coming up. So even though that number, that 23,400 really doesn't exist anywhere at this point, it hasn't been changed since we have an assessment pending. So a little science background. When I look through the history of longfin squid assessments, there's been kind of varying perspective on biomass trends, concern that it's headed low or that it's high. But in kind of most recent years, since 2010, there's been a focus on a swept area events. And it's basically expanding the survey. It takes the fall Science Center survey and NEMAP. And then the spring Science Center survey averages them. And this is what we get. So biomass, it's a bit of a stretch to call this. It's not like our other full quantitative statistical assessment models, but it gives us a sense of trends of biomass. And there's a lot of variability, and it seems to be well above our threshold and targets that are those dotted lines below the bouncing biomass line up top. There's no overfishing definition, but they do compare catch to those biomass estimates to get a sense of trends in exploitation. That's what these are, but there isn't an overfishing definition to really compare these two. The center did provide some updated indices for us, the Bigelow NEMAP indices, and pretty much to see typical variability. So this is a Science Center, spring on top, fall on the bottom, biomass on the left, abundance on the right. Again, just mostly variability here. It kind of continues to reflect what we see. Again, this is not the quote unquote assessment, but this is the most recent data that goes into it. And again, in the more recent years since last assessment, nothing of particular concern. And same with NEMAP here, spring on the left, fall on the right. The spring isn't used in the biomass extrapolations for the main trends we saw initially, but we have them there nonetheless. Okay, so for our advisory panel, we take some background data to them and then ask them to provide some inputs. I'm going to run through some of the background data first. So this is I said catch here, actually, I think this might not have discards in it, so it's really landings through 2023. You can see the early foreign fishery in the 70s was phased out. That's that gray line, the domestication of the fishery. And then, you know, we've had in-season quotas since 2000. That's that vertical dotted line. And then just a good bit of variability since then. The last 2 years, relatively high at the far right end of that graph. Prices, we have seen some substantial changes in prices since COVID. There are some data issues with cams, with the squids and a few dealers, revenues not making it through the system. So there's a little bit more uncertainty with that 2023 data point. But our AP generally confirmed their perspective also that prices are substantially down. There's a little more uncertainty in that last data point that that NIMS is working on sorting that out. But I think it does reflect you know, the general trends in prices, and was confirmed by our AP. Just in terms of where these landings are going into, Rhode Island, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, mostly. The areas on the right in terms of where they're coming from. So left where they're going into, right where they're coming from. And I think what I'm going to try to share Firefox here. The Science Center also provided some heat maps of recent landings for us. So we've got 21 and 20, so 18, 19, and 20, trimester 2 on the upper left here. So that's really the summer fishery. You can see a lot of landings. Yellow and green are the most intense landings here on this particular color scheme. So you can see a lot of landings along Long Island, and south is Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. Very similar for the last 2 years in terms of where landings are concentrated in trimester 2 in the summer. And then if we look at the other 2 trimesters, trimester 1 here is now on the left, trimester 3. So these are more of the offshore, although 3 on the right has some kind of transition. But you can see, again, yellow and green is the most intense landings areas, then yellow. And so you have more of an offshore fishery in the winter season here. Again, trimester 3 is a bit of a mix. So these 2 are 18, 19, and 20. And then when we scroll down here to the last 2 years, you can see generally similar patterns of in these trimesters 1 and 3 being more of an offshore fishery. Okay, I'm going to go back to presentation here. Okay, so 2022 and 23 landings by week. This is just a NIMS quota monitoring report that's accessible on Garfo's website. Here is 2023 and the yellow-orange 2022. So the fishery operated fairly similarly in 2022 and 2023. Those flat periods are August. Those are when the closures occurred. And when the fishery had reached its trimester 2 quotas in August, those 2 years there. Fishery doesn't always close in trimester 2, but the last 2 years it had. I think that first week after in blue after the closure there, I think the Garfo folks said that may have been like the most weekly landings of longfin squid that either they'd seen in a long time or they'd ever seen. It was, but some weeks when it reopens, the squid just aren't there in the past. Sometimes they're there when it reopens. It's kind of random. So here we have trimester 1 in blue from this year, 24, and then trimester 1 from 2023 in orange there. So, similar, relatively quiet trimester 1s last year and this year. And this is trimester 2, so those landings in 2024, trimester 2, 2024 in blue. So it's the current year, last year in orange. So still relatively quiet for trimester 2 so far. So our AP fishery performance reports kind of take that little data overview and then try to incorporate the perspectives of our advisory panels to the SSC, the monitoring committee, and the council when setting or reviewing measures. So the fishery performance reports are in the briefing documents, but to hit a few of the highlights, those low prices, they've flagged kind of a COVID hangover still, and high production. They've had a lot of product frozen. Processors put some trip limits in 2023 to slow landings down. And so, that plus the trimester 2 closures would have reduced landings a bit versus what otherwise may have happened. So with a higher inventory, they've seen lower prices and demand for higher quality squid at a given price. They flagged that diesel costs have been higher in recent years, and that affects both the vessels and the processors who might use diesel for refrigeration, powering refrigeration. Some boats have been targeting other species as opportunities arise, and continue to flag that there are a lot of area-based and or gear restrictions that reduce landings or increase costs compared to if those weren't there, whether it's the scup GRAs or lobster restricted gear areas that are designed to separate gear, or the monuments. There's a variety of spatial and gear restraints on this fishery. Some general concerns that they flagged, wind farm concerns, and actually I'll go back to my few, the marine traffic website has, if the fishery was really busy, so this is just AIS transponders. If the fishery was really busy right now, you would see more of these orange triangles. It would be vessels fishing for squid. But you can kind of see just south of the islands from those previous heat maps. I mean, we know this is a squid area. You can see that wind farm either constructed or under construction there, kind of in that squid area. So that's a big concern for this fishery that they've been flagging for a number of years and continue to flag. The AP overall's recommendation was to keep status quo given performance, and we have a research track assessment ongoing. They've kind of noted there's a lot of effort going into improving science. Industry is collaborating in a bunch of different squid projects in that assessment to try to improve and move squid science forward. We're also kind of pinging our APs this year on research recommendations, but given the timing of that particular meeting, we're going to follow up with the APs with this AP later on research recommendations. Oops. Okay, so staff's ABC recommendation to the SSC was to maintain what we're at. Really don't have any new assessment information. Landings indices kind of continue their variability. The AP didn't raise any major ABC related issues. And again, we've got that research track underway. That went to the SSC. They reviewed kind of this same group of information here, and they concluded that the available evidence did not support recommending any changes, and that they recommended continuing the previously specified 2025 ABC, which would keep things the same as now with the 2024 ABC. So that's it for my presentation. Turn it back to you. Again, no action is needed unless the council decides that some change is appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Any questions or comments for Jason? Dan Farnham?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. Jason, can you bring up the prices for the squid? There was one slide with the time series. Now, am I reading that correct? Are they in 2023? Were we looking at the lowest inflation adjusted price ever in the whole time series?
Inflation adjusted, yes.
Yep, very, very good. Thank you.
And this was some monthly prices that Garfo had calculated for me for some background. And so you can see when you break it down by month, there's even, those trends mask some of this real variability that can happen within a few months. You can get a lot of variability in squid prices.
Anything else for Jason on this topic? All right, Michelle Duval.
Just a comment that I really like the heat maps I do like heat maps, and it would be interesting to maybe overlay those with maps of temperature or something like that. So just informative.
And the Squid Squad, is integrating some environmental data scientists, squid scientists, industry, trying to really figure out, can we detect, correlate, and predict environmental variability with squid productivity. And I think you've seen a few of those presentations. There seems like there's something there, but we haven't totally deciphered it yet.
All right, thank you, Jason. That should cover it for the longfin squid. Let's move on to the Illex squid. The council will also review the previously adopted 2025 specs for the squids and maintain status quo from 2024. Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just take me one moment to get. Okay, you see the full presentation view now?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so for Illex Squid, we're reviewing 2025, and the council previously set for 2024 and 2025. Likewise, we're expecting a final rule for implementing these pretty soon, but there wasn't much change from 23. So anyway, it's not critical that they haven't been implemented yet, but we're expecting a final rule pretty soon. In terms of the presentation today, similar kind of content as with Longfin. So again, this is in one of the older FMPs. It's a smaller group of vessels with permits. It's about 75. The ABC right now is at 40,000 metric tons. We see a lot of variability with this fishery year to year, but as we'll discuss a little bit later, kind of apparent low risk that any of the variable landings might lead to insufficient escapement, i.e. Not leaving enough Illex for the kind of future generations. Set about 3.5% aside for potential discards. And then once that final rule is implemented, this will be a little bit higher because discards appear to have gone down a bit, but we're looking at about 85 million pounds for 24 and 25. Just another little management update. You took action in October 2023 on an action for Illex hold volume measurements and upgrade restrictions. NIMS was originally going to do a categorical exclusion and take care of the other documentation. I think they're still doing that categorical exclusion for NEPA, which keeps things simple. But I kind of reviewed my emails and just kind of a timeline update. Late 2023, NIMS had doing some workload issues, was trying to crank out those documents. early 2024. They started working on it more, but then in early May 2024, they flagged that they needed us to create those supporting documents. And then so a few weeks later, and just at the end of May, we kind of officially submitted those. And I've gotten some edits back on that. So I know if people are interested in that action, just an update on that. So we're working on those edits, and I think once we'll get that done soon, and I'm expecting a proposed rule from NIM soon after that. So some science background. There's no real typical assessment, but we have these kind of a variety of theoretical and empirical analyses that really suggest that overfishing is unlikely it catches less than 40,000 metric tons. It's an escapement model kind of developed by Paul Rago and several other analyses, but basically it looks at, if you make some range of reasonable assumptions about catchability and natural mortality and biomass that you start off with, that across a broad range of those assumptions, we don't think catches less than or equal to 40,000 metric tons are going to cause a problem. But the SSC continues to note we've got a lot of uncertainty for, our overall understanding of Illex population dynamics, and they've continued to recommend, trying to collect high resolution fishery data and investigate the reproductive biology of Illex. And that's part of what the Squid Squad has been trying to do. We did get some updated indices for Bigelow, spring on the top, fall on the bottom, biomass on the left, abundance on the right, and just kind of continued variability. 23 was a bit low, but not crazy low. In terms of the fall abundance index, just kind of seen as like, what's left over after the fishery occurs. It's a potential like an escapement index, but again, a lot of variability there. So some highlights from the AP information document and then the fishery performance report itself. So like longfin squid, we had the foreign fishery in the 70s phased out, a lot of variability with the domestic fishery. These late 20-teens, 5 years of high productivity, almost all the way to the right, were kind of really an unusual period of high productivity. In the last 2 years, kind of returned to the variability that we expect. In the last couple of years have been pretty low, but not out of the range that we've seen. This is index Illex prices, general overall trend up, but good bit of variability year to year. AP always flags that our Illex are going into a big squid protein market. We're kind of a drop in the bucket in that in that squid protein market. So again, 2023 in blue, 2022 in orange were both pretty low years, and they operated to each other. Highlights from the AP, relatively stable market conditions. The freezer vessels said, 2023 wasn't great, but they still went out. They still caught Illex. They've kind of, the AP kind of reinforced that 2022 and 2023 showed typical variability in this fishery, and that they continue to encourage the SSC and Council to take a big picture view of Illex, really both the squid fisheries, but in terms of the variability that you'd expect. They did note that some monoliners they talked to saw some sign of Illex off the shelf in the coral zones. So maybe whatever kind of environmental conditions that do push Illex up onto the shelf didn't occur maybe. And again, they flagged that U.S. production is pretty small compared to global similar products. They've also noted both the squids were recertified by MSC as an indication of sustainability, and they recommended status quo measures. And there's no formal voting, but that was the general sense from the AP. No one opposed. No one seemed to indicate that anything else besides status quo was their preference. Staff recommendation to the SSC was also to maintain the current ABC. Fairly similar story with Squid. No new assessment with Longfin Squid. No new assessment information. Landings and indices continue to vary. No major ABC issues raised by the AP. And we'll have an update of those RAGO escapement analyses and some other work with the management track assessment for Illex in 2025. I'll continue here. I will show the heat maps for Illex too once I wrap up here. But so the SSC took this information and they, as a similar conclusion with Longfin Squid, the available evidence didn't support changes, and they recommended continuing the previously specified 2025 ABC, which would be the same as 2024. So again, no action is needed by the council. I'll pull up the Illex heat maps here just to get a sense of where this fishery occurs. So this is 2018 and 2020 on the left, 21 and 22 on the right. And I think there's some issue with 23, so they didn't update that here, but you can see where this fishery occurs. It's out right along the shelf edge for the most part, and pretty consistent in these two time blocks. And again, green is the most intense catch, followed by yellow on these on this color scheme. And I'll turn it back to you for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Any questions or comments for Jason? Any comments from the audience? Greg?
Greg DiDomenico, Lunds Fisheries. Just want to make some brief comments, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. Just want to make some comments about both what you did here today on Loligo and Illex. These type of long-term stable quotas and sound science makes it a lot easier for us to plan for the future, invest in efficiency, meet the needs and expectations of our customers, and also do what's best for our employees and our workforce. And so again, this type of 2-year status quo measures are extremely helpful to a business like Lunds, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Any more comments? Seeing none, thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you. Take care.
Hang on one second. Anybody recommend any changes to the fishery? Nope. Seeing none. Okay, Jason, thank you. Let's move on to unmanaged commercial landings report. Julia Beatty will give us a report on the annual report for the unmanaged commercial landings. The EOP and AP and committee did not recommend the use of specific quantitative thresholds to trigger further evaluation and consideration for management. Whenever you're ready, Julia.
All right, I'm assuming the presentation looks good. All right, so I'm going to cover this year's unmanaged commercial landings report. I also wanted to note that Sarah Turner with Garfo is also available online. She might help answer some questions. And Sarah did most of the work with the data in this report. So she's been a huge help in terms of updating the data and helping dig into some things and answer some questions. So I wanted to make sure I acknowledge her role in this too. So for my presentation, I'm going to review this year's report, review the feedback that we got from the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning AP and committee. And then for the council discussion, it would be useful for the council to provide feedback on the report in terms of any questions that you have, anything that you think should be further evaluated, anything that looks like it could be of concern, or any potential improvements for future reports. But first, I'll provide some background on why the council gets these reports every year. So these reports are a follow-on action from the Unmanaged Forage Omnibus Amendment. The council took final action on that amendment in 2016, and it was implemented in 2017. The goal of that amendment was to prohibit the development of new and expansion of existing directed commercial fisheries on unmanaged forage species in mid-Atlantic federal waters. Not indefinitely, but only until the council has had an adequate opportunity to both assess the scientific information relating to any new or expanded directed fisheries and consider potential impacts to existing fisheries, fishing communities, and the marine ecosystem. So through this amendment, the council sought to protect the structure and function of marine ecosystems from the potential threat of unregulated, unsustainable levels of commercial harvests of forage species and to advance an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. So to achieve that goal, the council implemented a commercial possession limit of 1,700 pounds of combined weight for over 50 previously unmanaged forage species in mid-Atlantic federal waters. As I noted in my earlier presentation this afternoon, through the forage amendment, the council also established the first management measures for Atlantic chub mackerel, which have been since replaced by the Amendment 21 measures. But chub mackerel is a useful example for this report because you can, as we talked about earlier, there was this increase in landings in 2013. And the council wasn't aware of this until probably around maybe late 2015 when the FMAT for the forage amendment was starting to look into landings of unmanaged species to try to think about what species would be priorities for including in the forage amendment. And it was at that time that the council became aware of this 2013 increase in chub mackerel landings. So this is the sort of thing that the council wants to monitor for in the future. So if there is a big change in an unmanaged fishery, the council has a way to know about it without too much of a time lag. And also the forage amendment doesn't cover all unmanaged species. And then the council is also interested in, through these reports, monitoring the landings of the ecosystem component species in the forage amendment, just to kind of keep track of those fisheries and see how they're performing under that 1,700 pound possession limit. Those are all part of the background of why we get these unmanaged landings reports, which we've been getting since 2018. Again, the data is mostly accumulated by staff at Garfo, and they work together with council staff to kind of package it in these reports. So the goal of these unmanaged landings reports is to monitor for signs of developing unmanaged commercial fisheries in the mid-Atlantic. And new or growing fisheries could develop for a number of reasons. We know that species distributions are changing, markets can change over time. There could be changes in other fisheries that impact these unmanaged species. And so this year in the report, the AP and the committee wanted the report to state kind of upfront that increasing unmanaged landings don't necessarily indicate an ecological issue or a need for management, but rather the goal of these reports is that they should serve as a high-level summary to help determine if further evaluation is needed and if consideration of a potential management response may be warranted. So for the purposes of these reports, we've adopted this definition of what it means to be unmanaged. So for the purposes of these reports only, unmanaged means landings of a species in a location where there's no possession limit, no size limit, no seasonal closure, or limited access. So for example, we know that some states might have an open access commercial landings permit that allows, anyone can get this permit, they can harvest a whole bunch of different species. They might have to report what they catch, but if there's no possession limit, size limit, seasonal closure, or limited access, then that would not count as managed, because we thought that these measures would be things that would be more kind of constraining harvest as opposed to just monitoring it. So each year, we reach out to the states and we ask them for updates on changes to their commercial measures, so we can be sure that the reports are capturing landings only in places where each species is not managed. So for example, white perch is a species that's managed in some states, but not all states. If any white perch landings show up in the report, those would only be landings in the states where there's no possession limit, size limit, seasonal closure, or limited access for that species. The data now come from the Catch Accounting and Monitoring System, or CAMS. CAMS includes federal dealer reports and state-only dealer reports. That's a question that has come up in the past is, are these data accounting for state-only dealers? And yes, they are. Since we're using CAMS now, that also pulls in some data from commercial vessel trip reports. So we do think overall that the data set is pretty comprehensive, and we don't think we're missing anything major or have any data gaps that would be important. This year, something different or additional that the council wanted to think about for this report, it's on the implementation plan to consider possible landings thresholds for further evaluation for management. Because previous versions of this report just kind of included a lot of information, but from the staff perspective, it sometimes felt challenging to draw definitive conclusions about what may or may not be of concern, because it didn't feel like there was like guidance from the council in terms of this is the sort of thing that would trigger concern. So that was something that we talked about this year with the EOP, AP, and committee that met back in April to discuss this. And in terms of the specific landings threshold concept, they actually did not recommend the use of a specific quantitative threshold to trigger further evaluation, because after talking about the reports in more detail and the type of information that might be useful, they thought that instead of a quantitative threshold, that it would be more useful for the reports to include additional contextual information on the landings, and also the input from the committee, the AP, and other stakeholders could help guide the considerations more holistically on a case-by-case basis. So they thought that a quantitative threshold would be kind of too simplistic and wouldn't really look at the whole picture. So they provided some suggestions for additional information that could be added to the reports to help make them more useful. And so the AP and committee met back in April. We incorporated some of their suggestions, but not all of them, into the report, just in the interest of time. But this would be useful for the council to talk about in terms of, is there more that should be done in future reports, and what are the priorities for additional information to add in there. So the additional contextual information that the AP and committee thought would be important would be things like the life history of each species, their distribution. So for example, are they mostly in state waters or federal waters? Whether landings are highly localized or spread across the region. So for example, if landings are relatively high, but they're more spread out, that might be of less concern as if landings are at that same level, but in one specific location, because that could lead to potential concerns about localized depletion. So they thought this type of information might be useful. If you look at the report and the briefing materials, you can see that there's a whole lot of species in the report, and it would be very challenging to provide all of this information for everything in the report. So instead, we provided some of this just for a few species that had some of the higher landings. But again, it'd be useful for the council to consider if it should be done for other species as well. The AP and the committee also recommended showing the % change in landings by species to help make a more clear description of how things have changed over time. Again, that's something that we did just for a subset of the species, just to kind of make it more manageable and to focus on species with increasing landings, because we didn't think it was necessarily of concern if the percentage was decreasing. They also recommended adding the annual rank order for each species to the table that's based on rank order, which you'll see on a later slide. We did do that one. That was very simple. So we just went ahead and did that for everything in that table. And then they also recommended clearly differentiating landings of invasive species. So for that topic, they talked about how in several ways there are invasive species in the reports that are not managed, but they're kind of the opposite of everything else in the report. where they cause a lot of ecological harm, and managers would generally want to see huge increases in landings of invasive species. And that would actually not be a cause for concern or a reason to consider management. And there was also some discussion of blue catfish specifically, which has some of the highest unmanaged landings in the report. And before, it was just grouped in with everything else. And some people thought that the much higher scale of the blue catfish landings kind of distracted from everything else. There was also a discussion of it might still be useful to include landings of invasive species because managers might be interested in how those landings have changed over time. Maybe trends in those landings could help give an idea of changes in availability or the success of programs that are designed to encourage harvesting of those species. So the group thought it would be important to still include that information in there, but make it more obvious which species were invasive. And they talked about a few different ways to do that. And what staff ended up doing in the report was just pulling them out and putting them in a separate table that's at the end of the report. And it's called non-native species because European flat oyster is also in the report. You can see the landings are 0 or confidential. They're pretty low, but they're still in the report. This is technically a non-native species, but it's not problematic to the extent that these other invasive species are. So that's why we're labeling this table non-native species. So the other species in the report are blue catfish, green crab, lionfish, and Japanese shore crab. So they're here, they're in this table. They're not included in any of the other slides later in this presentation, and they're not incorporated into any of the other conclusions in the report. So next I'm gonna highlight the species that were in the top 10 for unmanaged landings each year over the most recent 5 years. I'm going to show just some highlights of that information, but there's more details in table 3 in the report. So this is an example where we added in some notes based on some of that contextual information that the APN committee recommended. So I'm going to walk through this one at a time. Blue mussels had the highest unmanaged landings in recent years. They were in the top 10 each year. And they were I think in number 1 or 2 for the most recent 5 years consistently. So the recent maximum for those landings was about 5.3 million pounds. And you can see on the slide here that more than 90% of those landings came from state permits and were concentrated in New England. Hagfish was also in the top 10 and had a recent 5-year maximum of 2.3 million pounds. Almost all of those landings are from federal permits and are concentrated in New England. Conchs were also in the top 10 and had a recent maximum of about 1.8 million pounds. Almost 80% of those landings are from state permits, and those landings were spread throughout the Mid-Atlantic and New England. Atlantic cutlass fish, I do have more slides on this at the end with some additional considerations for cutlass fish, but based on how it's shown in the report, it shows a recent high of 1.1 million pounds, which might be a little bit higher due to some potential misreporting that I'll talk about on a later slide. But more than 70% of the cutlass fish landings were from state permits, and they were highly concentrated in the Mid-Atlantic, with most in Virginia and North Carolina. King whiting, which is I think there was a question about what king whiting is in previous years, but the species code that goes along with it refers to the genus of Menticeras, I think that's how that's pronounced, which is also known as king croaker or kingfish croaker. It includes the species northern kingfish or northern king croaker, which might be most of these landings. So just to clarify what king whiting is. You can see the recent high there was about 763,000 pounds. Almost 70% of those came from state permits, with landings spread between the Mid-Atlantic and New England. And lastly, sugar kelp was also in the top 10 each year. This was on the lower end of these species that were in the top 10, with a recent maximum of 256,000 and change. All of those landings were from state permits in New England. So from the notes here, you can see that some of these species were more state permits, more New England. The Mid-Atlantic Council there's not so much that the Mid-Atlantic Council can do about that. So if we focus just on those species that had some landings in the Mid-Atlantic and some amount of landings from federal permits, that includes conchs, Atlantic cutlassfish, and king whiting. There's also a table in the report, table 5, which is similar to previous years, that shows increasing or stable rank order. And so the value in parentheses is a new addition. That's the rank order each year. So you can see blue mussels in the most recent 4 years was ranked either number 1 or number 2. So this is just highlighting those species in table 5 that had at least 20,000 pounds of landings in at least one recent year. But table 5 includes more species and more years. So this is just kind of zooming in on recent years for the species with the higher landings, thinking that maybe the council has, more interest in those species. But if you want to see more information, look at table 5 in the report. So you can see here that blue mussel, Atlantic cutlassfish, ribbon fishes, and OPA all had increasing or stable rank order in recent years. And you can see the level of landings that are there. Next, there's table 6, which shows increasing landings. So regardless of rank order, whether they were consistently increasing from 2020 to 2023. Again, this version of the table is just focusing in on recent years and the species that had at least 20,000 pounds of landing in at least one recent year. You can see table 6 for more information on more species and more years. But the species that, that had at least 20,000 pounds of landings in at least one recent year were conchs, king whiting, and OPA. And you can see the percentage change from year to year on the slide here. Again, this is an example where we just added the percentages for just a few of the species with the higher landings, just to kind of keep the workload more manageable in the interest of time. Next, there's a table in the report. This is table 4 for the ecosystem component species. So these are the species that do have that 1,700 pound possession limit through the forage amendment. If they have additional measures at the state level, they were filtered out. So for example, I think silversides are managed in Connecticut. I think sand lances are managed in Massachusetts. So those are individual examples where landings of those species in those states are not included in the report. But if the forage amendment possession limit is the only thing for these species, then they're still included in here because the council wanted to track landings of these species relative to the forage amendment management. So on the previous slide, I mentioned that there's over 50 species that fall into this ecosystem component definition. You can see there's a lot less than 50 on the screen here. That's because these are the only species that are on that list that actually show up in the landings data. You can also see that some of these categories might include some managed species. So the categories of unclassified herrings or squids down at the bottom there. There's not, that maybe that includes some managed species. That's just an example of things that weren't classified down to the species level. So some takeaway messages from this table. You can see that most of these landings have been generally pretty low and variable, but some of the species in this table with the highest landings, for example, on the average over 2015 through 2023, include silversides with about 86,000 pounds on average per year over that time period, and round herring with about 68,000 pounds on average per year over that time period. Compared to the other ecosystem component species, round herring had the greatest increase in landings in 2023, which you can see on the slide here. It increased from 8,814 pounds in 2022 to 428-ish thousand pounds in 2023. Most of the landings of round herring were associated with federal permits and were landed in New England. I also noted that silversides had higher average landings than the other species in the table here. You can see they actually decreased from 2022 going into 2023. And most of the unmanaged landings of silversides are from state permits and were landed in New England. You can also see a lot of Cs in this table, which is for the confidential data representing fewer than 3 vessels and or dealers. And so to provide a bit more context on the confidential data, for most of these species, so if you look in the report on table 4, you can see a longer time series. So everything through Lollaginidae, squids, there are more instances of seas. There's a longer time series of data. So for those species and with the higher levels of landings that are shown in the report, none of the Cs are higher than what's shown there. So none of the Cs would be like a maximum value. But for the things lower down on the table, like bay anchovies and lower, where there's a lot more Cs and more zeros, so you can't really tell so much what's going on there. For those species with the lower levels of landings towards the bottom of the table, none of those Cs exceeded 8,000 pounds, and most were much, much lower than that. So we think overall that from the staff perspective, that none of these Cs are really of concern, and that you're not like missing any major trends by that masking of the confidential data. So this version of the report also includes a conclusion section, which is a new addition. In prior years, it didn't really have strong conclusions, and I think that was a challenge for some folks to read the reports and know what to do with it. So this is the first time that staff are putting forward a conclusion. Again, the AP and the committee did not recommend the use of specific quantitative thresholds to trigger further evaluation or to indicate a concern. So staff tried to take the approach of kind of just looking at things holistically and thinking about what might be of concern to the council. So the suggestion from staff is that none of the landings in the report are of immediate concern to the Mid-Atlantic Council, keeping in mind that, the council it doesn't really play a role in managing fisheries in New England or fisheries that are only in state waters, for example. So the preliminary conclusion is that the staff don't think that anything is of immediate concern, but it might be worth continuing to monitor Atlantic cutlass fish. And the conclusion stated in the report is that landings of cutlass fish have been increasing, have exceeded 1 million pound in recent years, and are highly concentrated in the Mid-Atlantic. So this is from the report. And then in the past 24 hours, multiple people emailed me to ask about cutlass fish. And I'm glad that those people reached out to me ahead enough that I could dig into this a little bit more before this presentation. So this is new information that's not in the report. There were multiple questions about what's a cutlass fish as opposed to a dealfish or a ribbon fish, which dealfish and ribbon fish are listed separately in the report. And multiple people over email suggested that dealfish and ribbon fish are probably also cutlass fish, because ribbon fish is a common name for cutlass fish. So there was a question about, are they really different or are they all the same? And so looking into it a little bit more, we think that they're probably all actually cutlass fish. Can't say for sure, but it seems likely that the dealfish and ribbon fish's landings are potentially also cutlass fish. So you can see on the slide here that there's some differences in the habitats, that dealfish are found in deeper waters. Ribbon fish includes multiple species that are found over a wide area. So maybe there's some actual commercial landings of ribbon fishes, but based on some email exchanges, I'm not totally sure if that's the case, and it's probably more likely that the ribbon fishes are actually cutlass fish. So Sarah with Garfo was able to look into this morning, and super appreciate that last minute data analysis. And she determined that the majority of the dealer reports listed the species as cutlass fish, but the majority of the VTRs reported ribbon fish. So it's probably that lends further support to the idea that maybe it's just misreporting, probably due to confusion about local common names, or maybe some just misidentification. But if ribbon fish is like a very commonly used local name, we think it's possible that these are all Atlantic cutlass fish. So if we take those three separate rows in the tables and combine them together, if that's an accurate assumption, then the bottom row here shows what those landings would be. So it doesn't totally change the story about cutlass fish, but it does show that landings are a little bit higher than what was otherwise in the report. So just something to keep in mind when it comes to cutlass fish, and if this rises to the level of concern for the council. That's all I had. Again, the purpose of this discussion is just for the council to provide feedback on the report. It'd be useful for the council to talk about if anything seems like it's of concern, if there's other improvements that could be made to the report in future years. And And again, if you have any specific questions, I might lean on Sarah Turner to help answer some of those more data related questions. But that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And thank you, Sarah. At the moment, there is no action needed, but we can provide feedback to Julia where there's any additional modifications, anything else we'd like to see on this report. Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not necessarily anything more to see. I just really wanted to thank Julia and Sarah for all their efforts to incorporate the committee and the advisory panel's recommendations. We had a pretty robust discussion about this during our meeting, and I think you guys have done an excellent job of trying to, address that. And I'm sure the report will continue to, evolve over time, but really appreciate what you all have done and also for digging into the cutlass fish issue. Thanks.
Chris Pat Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you, Julia and Sarah for the presentation and data analysis. And yeah, answer my questions about ribbon fish and cutlass fish. That definitely makes sense. I had a question about the king whiting or kingfishes, and it might be more to Sarah. Is that looking at only one species of Menaceres kingfish? Because North Carolina doesn't have any regulations either, so I'm assuming North Carolina landings are part of that. But when I look at our landings, it's higher than what's reported here. But we get 3 species of kingfishes in our state, and they're all just lumped together in the commercial landing. So I didn't know if your analysis was just looking at like northern kingfish, for instance, or was it a combination of the 3 different species? Thanks.
I can start to answer that and maybe Sarah could add on, but I do know that the way that one in the report is listed, it is at the genus level, so it could include multiple species, and there might be separate rows if it was reported to the individual species level, so they could still be in there, just not rising to the level that they showed up in the tables.
I'd have to dig into how the different whiting species are identified in our database to be able to answer that thoroughly. I'm not, off the top of my head, I'm not sure how many different species there are with similar names or similar families. So I'd have to look into that to get a good answer for you.
Rich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank Julie and Sarah also. And I had a quick question about cutlass fish. What is the main value of that harvesting that species? Is it bait, food, fish, or just wondering if you knew that? Thank you.
I can start. Maybe some of the Virginia, North Carolina council members might know more than me, but I've heard that they are used as a food fish and that they are, sold in fish markets and for food purposes. Maybe there's also some bait, but I do know that they are a food fish.
All right. Any more comments, questions around the table? Seeing none, thank you very much, Julia. It's 2:57. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back at 3:10 and tackle the SSC's overfishing limit, and we'll make sure we got Dr. Rago on the line this time. And also, anybody that wants to pay for tonight's dinner, you can go over and see Shelley. She can take it now, so we won't have a backup at the restaurant tonight.
Hey, Paul Rago, you want to try and check your audio?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you sound good.
Perfect. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Let's move on to the SSC's overfishing, the OFL coefficient of variation CV guidance document. Dr. Rago will present the recommended modifications and updates to the OFL CV guidance document. Dr. Rago, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much. Could I have the first slide, please? Assuming that came through, could you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this important document, and apologies for not being there today. I'd hoped to, up until yesterday morning, I was planning to be there. All of the information associated with this document is under tab 8, and there's a lot of it. And so what I'll try to do is kind of give you the conceptual overview of the material there. So next slide, please. Okay. I guess in terms of a basic overview, what is this document? Why is it important? What changes are we proposing? Give you some of the basis for those changes, and then talk a bit about the implications for scientific advice. This document uses a lot of acronyms, and not only that, it concatenates acronyms together, so it can be a bit confusing. But we do want to have everyone have a good understanding of where this process begins and what its implications are. So next slide, please. So this guidance document, there we go. Yeah, the guidance document is really related to the primary responsibility of the SSC, which is to derive an acceptable biological catch given some estimate of the OFL, the overfishing limit. That is the maximum limit that can be obtained when you fish at the FMSY proxy. So again, I'm using a lot of acronyms here. Hopefully most of these are well known to you. But the ABC is the acceptable biological catch, emphasis on biological, and its relationship to what is distilled from the stock assessment, which is the overfishing limit. And the key to making this thing work is twofold. One is to address the council's risk policy, and then secondly, to estimate the uncertainty of the overfishing limit. So if we go to the next slide, the council's risk policy kind of boils down to this single graph, which is relates two entities. The first is the relative stock size, and that's the ratio of the current stock size to what we think is the biomass at maximum sustainable yield. It's a piecewise linear function, and on the y-axis you have the acceptable probability of overfishing. This is oftentimes called P star, will be referenced to as a shorthand. So next slide, please. There's an upper limit on this thing, which is 50%, roughly 49%. And so what that means is that the council is willing to accept overfishing 49% of the time, and 51% of the time it wants to avoid overfishing. Now, there's a legal limit on that P star value, which is 0.5, and that of course relates to earlier legal cases in which programs were said to be insufficient or inadequate if they allowed greater than 50-50 chance of overfishing. So that's the first consideration, is this upper bound. Next slide, please. The second major component here is that there is a lower limit, and that is when the stock is at 10%, you have a 0% chance of overfishing, and that means that there is the fishery is shut down. So between those two extremes, say 10% of the BMSY value and some multiplier of that, there are a lot of options there. So there are three relevant cut points: that 0.1, which is the 10%, the 1.0, which is when the stock is at BMSY, and then when it's 50% above, so that 1.5. Next slide, please. So the risk policy and the council's adoption of it was based on extensive simulations. And they examined a lot of different trade-offs associated with different levels of overfishing. So there were considerations about the rate of fluctuation in catch levels, the implications for potentially triggering rebuilding. A lot of different things went into it, and the council spent a lot of time reviewing not only the simulations, but how best to encapsulate their risk tolerance. So it is important. So the next big question is, where does this OFL CV fit in? So the next slide, please. So the uncertainty of the OFL is the coefficient of variation, and it's roughly equal to the standard error divided by the mean. When it's estimated, such as in an MREP context, it's oftentimes expressed as proportional standard error. So it's sort of the error fraction over the mean. So that gives you a measure of the relative variability. In this case, it's different. The CV, the coefficient of variation, is defined externally to the assessment model. Now, you say, why is that? Well, for one thing, the assessment model only characterizes the true variation if, and that's capitalized there, if the model is true. That is, if we're smart enough to think we know what the truth is. But there's alternative models that could be applied, and they could give different estimates of that magnitude of variability. So if you were prescient, all-knowing, omniscient, you would be able to define what the true underlying uncertainty is of the overfishing limit. But it's really not possible to do all that. So one of the ways in which that is addressed is through simulation analysis. And the guidance document was originally developed based on a lot of simulations Mike Wilberg and John Wiedemann have done, in which the OFL CV bins, so to speak, roughly fall into really good, which is 60%, sort of okay, average is 100%, and then sort of the remainder in the 150% range. So the obvious or immediate implications of that: the larger the CV, the greater the difference between the OFL and the ABC. So when the ABC or when the OFL CV increases, that is when it's at the higher limit, you have lower catches. There's a bigger difference between those. So this all kind of begs the question, well, how do you estimate that? And how do you actually get to 60, 100, or 150%? So next slide, please. What we do is a relatively complex but transparent process in which we evaluate 9 factors for setting the uncertainty. And for each of those factors, there are a set of criteria that are evaluated. So data quality may have, there are a lot of specificity about what we consider to be really good data quality and other, and then on the gradient to really poor data quality. And similar kinds of things are used for how the model is identified. How well does the model perform? We talk a lot about retrospective patterns. That is, updates of the model reveal that we weren't as smart as we thought we were in the previous time step, and therefore we downgrade the information that we get out of the current one, because we don't know whether the subsequent ones will reveal what we didn't know. In many cases, it's important to consider external experiments. A lot of industry-based research recently has been looking at catchability and how well that relates to the measures of catchability taken in research vessels and gear. We incorporate ecosystem information and look at, how well are relationships established, how well can we sort of predict their future state, and how is the population responding. The Illex squid is a good example, where there are a lot of people looking at the relationship between ocean currents and the delivery of external offshore populations of Illex into the inshore. Other experiments in ecosystem data have looked at, changing distributions, which we talked about yesterday and today, and also, a variety of other factors. Many populations are subject to trends in recruitment. Does it make sense to base our projections on the historical record of recruitment when in the last 20 years we haven't seen anything like that? So, those are factors that come into our estimates of the CV. Finally, there are three on the bottom, and I'll get to in a moment, but one is prediction error. How well do we specify relationships between years, and do they hold up to our forecast from the previous year? So this is a ground truthing kind of thing. Another one is fishing mortality. It's oftentimes much easier to understand the dynamics of a population when fishing mortality is very high. That's usually a short-lived or short-lived phenomena. So a lot of fishery management is designed to counteract that process. And in fact, what has happened is that it makes it more difficult to actually apply this factor. And then finally, we're talking about management strategy evaluation, which is very labor and computer intensive, and is more aspirational. So next slide, please. What the SSC is proposing is to reduce the complexity of this a little bit, and to drop from 9 factors to 6 factors. And so some of these things, prediction error has become difficult. One factor is the changes in MRIP estimation with the recalibration really kind of limited your ability to make comparisons of previous models, because you were changing the entire basis. The scale of the population was changing as a result of the changes in MRIP. Another one is the research track process, where we have new assessment leads, we have a new conceptual basis, and so that has hampered the application of prediction error. So we're suggesting that factor be eliminated. I mentioned the problems of fishing mortality, and it's sort of the counterintuitive effect of effective fishing management makes that difficult to apply. And then finally, the management strategy evaluation is more of an aspirational thing, and really hasn't been done enough to. So we can still incorporate these factors, but not on a routine basis. Next slide, please. The second major factor is that we're recommending that 2 tiers be created. The first tier relates to data quality, the model appropriateness, and then how well the model performs. The underlying rationale is that inadequate data cannot be overcome irrespective of the sophistication of your models or consideration of any other external factors. The silk purse metaphor sort of applies here. So that tier 1 sort of establishes a floor for the overall level of CV. So if the data quality is evaluated to be 100%, then you can't really move the needle and get 60% by having some highly sophisticated modeling approach. Tier 2 still useful, but they are more in a sort of an advisory kind of capacity. You know, whether or not you have external experiments, ecosystem information, or evaluation of trends in recruitment. So the other major change, next slide, please, relates to the frequency of the 60% CV bin. A recent review of worldwide literature led by Dr. Jensen at the University of Wisconsin on our SSC suggested that 60% CV may be overly optimistic in the sense that it's infrequent, you know, and in fact, the earlier simulation studies support this conclusion. So even when the model was perfectly specified, given the errors associated, the typical errors associated with observations and so forth, CVs of 60% were sort of in the norm there. It was rare that anything below that was actually observed. So this is not a kind of a trivial problem. And it is expected, but it's not preordained that the OFL CV 60% will be used less frequency in the future assessment. I'll give you the scorecard in a moment here, but you can see that it's only, at the current time, it's only used infrequently. And then, you know, it's important to recognize that this is not a grade on the assessment quality, but, you know, what we think is a reflection of the inherent uncertainty in the underlying data and the models that we use to describe those data. So the next series of slides will discuss the potential consequences for the ABCs. So in this graph, what is shown is the relative stock size, again, the same axis that we use in the risk policy. But on the y-axis, in this case, we're looking at the ratio of the ABC to the OFL. That is, you know, what is that ratio? So if there's if the ABC is equal to the OFL, then the ratio is 1. And each of those separate lines are the different OFL CVs. Now, this graph is typically very hard to interpret, and one of them is because you have major differences between steep lines. So there are large drops between it. So I'll try to lead you through the process. So, you know, you notice, first of all, that it sort of looks like the previous risk policy slide in that it has kind of a piecewise linear thing, but then in the middle, between 10% and 100, you know, or B over BMSY of 1, it's curvilinear. So that non-linearity, so to speak, is important. But at the highest level, next slide, please, where the stock size is greater than 1.5 times BMSY, there's really limited impact. There's almost no change in the difference between those lines. Now, between 1 and 1.5, next slide, please, there's some impact. It's not large, but and I'll get to quantification of those in a moment there. In the next range, though, which is important, the range between 50% and 100% of BMSY. Next slide, please. This is kind of the red zone. There are significant impacts. So when the stock size is somewhere between the 50% of BMSY, which is the biomass threshold, and BMSY, which is the target, there can be some significant differences. And then finally, if you're below 50%, you're in a rebuilding program. So there you have that, you know, all bets are off. You've got a new regime that may apply in that context. So there are, you know, again, 3 areas where you know really are relevant here. I mean, it's the limited impact zone, the sum impact, and then significant impacts, and then The other one is a visit to New England for rebuilding plans. We're there a little bit too. But let's look at them in terms of the quantification. So the next slide, please, gives a sort of the actual, it's a tabulated value. Taking an OFL of 1,000 metric tons as a starting point, when the B over BMSY ratio is 1.5 or greater, you lose 14 tons. With a CV of 60%, you lose 27 tons. When the OFL CV is 150%, so there's a 1.3% difference between those quantities. When it's 1.25, there's a, going across that row there's a 3.9% difference between the lowest and the highest. When the stock is rebuilt, when it's fully at 1%, there's a 6.5% difference. So when the stock is in good shape, this OFL CV really doesn't do much one way or the other. It's a minor, less. It's 6.5% in this case. However, of course, when you get into situations where you're in the mid-range, where a lot of stocks are, for 75%, that range from 777 to 611 is in fact a 21% change. And then when you're at the threshold just before you're into a rebuilding program, it's a 36% change between the low and the high values. So you can see there's substantial change in there. I'm not minimizing its importance, but most of the differences occur in the range was sort of in the DMZ between the fully rebuilt, the B over BMSY is 1, and half rebuilt, the threshold. So, and next slide just kind of gives you the scorecard here. That it is in the report there, and basically the take-home message is at the top there. Only stock right now is Summer Flounder with a 60% CV. Atlantic Mackerels on the high end, 150%, and all the others are 100%. And there are a lot of not applicable ones. We've talked about 3 of them just before this presentation. The Squid and the mackerel, the Chub mackerel. And then this also has the years and how they've changed over time. So that's sort of the basic concept, the linkage between our OFL CV report and so forth. So the next slide, we are planning to use this process for the July SSC meeting, pending your approval. Some people have asked or wondered, can't you quantify this process a little bit more? And the answer is really not. It's sort of a false quantification process to try to assign values, numeric values to this. And we've talked about it many times, and we've generally come to the conclusion that it's not really ready for that kind of quantification. There are consequences for delayed assessments, and what we expect or anticipate is continuation of the status quo. But anytime you have delays between your information and your actions, you increase the uncertainty of information. So that may be something that factors in a later time. The interim updates typically don't move the needle, unless there's something catastrophic that occurs or some major change in fishery status. We have not, in general, recommended any changes to the previously identified models. And then finally, the new kid in town, the states-based model, WAM, that's going to have some implications for uncertainty. And You know, the take-home message is we're all learning. And you know, such models are thought to be better in terms of characterizing uncertainty. So we'll be evaluating our criteria as well as their application in the coming years here. So the summary recommendations, next page, relate to you know, first, that poor data can't be overcome by modeling or other factors. So that kind of leads to two tiers of criteria. The first one being data quality, model appropriateness, and the retrospective pattern. Tier 2 is related to empirical comparisons, ecosystem factors, and recruitment stanzas. The old criteria 7, 8, and 9 can still be embedded in that. They can still be factors, but they're not going to be primary determinants of the CV estimation. Finally, there's evidence that suggests that 60% may be less common. And there is in the report kind of an example application to SCUP. So we've given you not only all the new document, but also all the edits that we made. So in case you're really want some terrific reading, you can go through, characterize, you know, those changes and see the specificity of that. And then finally, I wanted to mention, next slide, please, are some of the recommendations from the public. You know, a lot of concern was expressed about the use of the OFL CV, 60%, and you know, the reduced likelihood of it. Again, it's not preordained, but we anticipate that it will be less commonly used. But right now, the flagship is summer flounder. There were, you know, a number of times it has been brought up that there's different uncertainty among the commercial and recreational fisheries. So it's important that those factors are at some point addressed. There's no real template for doing that right now, but the SSC does recognize that there are such differences. And then finally, you know, there were some recommendations to say, take that graph that with those steep nonlinear lines and just sort of put them in a tabular form so that you could see what the consequences were on a tabular basis. So that's all I have, Mr. Chairman, and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rago. Any questions or comments for Dr. Rago? Adam?
Thank you very much. So given this statement that the OFL CV of 60% may become less likely, did this review of the OFL CV recommendation process include a reconsideration of the appropriateness of the 60, 100, and 150 bins? And if not, what might trigger a reconsideration of those bins so that maybe we wind up with a first level of, say, 75 or 80 that the SSC could say, yeah, this is potentially attainable, whereas we're potentially looking at having an option that the public looks at and says, well, why bother having it if it's not attainable?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Adam, and I appreciate that. We have not sort of broached that topic as to whether or not there would be additional simulation analyses to support that, or review of historical simulations to see whether you know, an alternative binning criteria could be established. The scientific analysis of characterizing simulations, or excuse me, model performance worldwide suggests that 60% was a rare beast, and so there may be the opportunity to sort of draw from that and sort of reset the baseline into alternative bins as you've suggested. And then, finally, we're, as I noted, with the revised state-space models, we're all in a learning phase. That includes the members of the SSC as well, because we'll be seeing different depictions of the stock assessments, and those may have implications down the road. So the shortest answer I can give is it's a good suggestion. We don't know at this point, but I'll certainly take that back to the SSC for consideration. Thank you.
Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for that, Paul. And I guess a big shout out to all the folks who were involved in this review. I know it took a while and it was pretty intense, and I definitely appreciate the additional detail, I think, in that you all have added with respect to, I think, trying to clarify what the characteristics might be that would, lead to a 60% CV, within the actual text that's describing the different criteria that the SSC uses for determination of the OFL CV. And I guess maybe following on top of Adam's question in terms of reevaluation of the bins, did the subgroup or the SSC as a whole discuss like a cadence of regular review of this guidance document in general? Like when you might anticipate the next such review occurring? I know the last one was approved in 2020, so we're not too far out from that, but I was just curious if that was part of the conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I think in general, the overused metaphor, living document is something that really is part of this process, because each time we apply it, we take notes and recognize that we need to refine either the criteria or our evaluation of those criteria over time. So a big one would be reevaluating the bins. What does it take to move the needle within those criteria? So we hope that this will be an ongoing process. And I might add too that one of the things that, although it's a complicated rubric, so to speak, we make sure what I like to see is that, and what we do is that this is all done in public. The criteria are listed, they're available. There's a debate, public debate, and then there's a determination at the end. We write a synthetic narrative that summarizes all those things, and it doesn't change. So we even leave typos in. So we don't change what what was on the screen, what was available to the public or to the scientific community as part of this process. So there's kind of walk a tightrope a little bit there, but it's important that we maintain that level of transparency and apply those criteria as faithfully as we can.
Any more questions or comments for Dr. Rago? Go to the audience. Greg?
Hello, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you, Greg. Loud and clear.
Thank you. I just wanted to simplify something that's, pretty technical. For my purposes, having sat through most of these deliberations at the SSC, I just want to make sure that I understand this correctly, and that is the higher CV you assign to a particular species or assessment, the greater the difference is between the OFL and the ABC. And that means our ABCs in most cases will be lower. Is that correct to say?
Yeah, that's correct. In all cases, they'll be lower. You know,
Okay.
given what they could have been had they, the OFL been equal to the ABC.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you. And there is a public service award for having sat through all those meetings. So Wes will be offering that up later, a little bit later.
Any more questions or comments? In the past, the council has voted to approve the updates of the OFL-CV guidance document, and we're going to need one for this today. So, Mike, if you're ready.
I guess I'm going to have to be ready, even though I'm not thrilled about the consequences. I certainly respect the work and the science that goes into doing these types of evaluations. So I will go ahead and make a motion. Move to approve the SSC's or the SSC recommended changes to the OFL CV guidance document.
And seconded by Joe Grist. Discussion on the motion? Are there any objections to the motion? Any abstentions to the motion? One abstention. Motion carries 19-0 with one abstention. Thank you, Dr. Rago.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it.
And we'll talk to you tomorrow morning.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Now comes the part of the meeting. It's kind of sad because we're going to recognize some outgoing council members. And I'm going to move back to the back corner. So I'm going to move back here real quick.
Yep. So while the chairman is moving to the back of the room, just a couple of things. So it is, what time is it, Mike? 4 o'clock? 4-ish? 10 to 4. So very close to 4 o'clock. Tonight at 6 o'clock, we have the reception across the way at Jerry the Mermaid. So that starts at 6. Shelley has convinced me that we should open up hospitality starting between after we go through the award ceremony and before 6. So hospitality will be open. It's in the Peconic room, first floor of the hotel, in case you weren't there yesterday. Easy to find. If you have any questions, please let me know. And with that, I'll turn it over to Wes.
Thank you, Chris. Ever since I've been on the council, I've been looking at these people. So it's going to be sad next month or 2 months from now when I look out and don't see them at the table. So I'd like to start off by recognizing Sarah Winslow. She's the appointed at-large member from North Carolina. She is current chair of the River Herring and Shad. She's been vice chair of the Mackerel, Squid, and Butterfish, vice chair of Ecosystem and Ocean Planning. She's been on the Summer Flounder Scup Black Sea Bass Committee, Bluefish Committee, Protected Resources Committee, the HMS Committee, the Demersal and Coastal Migratory, and Executive Committee. Sarah served as the at-large member from North Carolina since 2015. Her appointment to the council was preceded by a long career with the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. During her time with the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, Sarah led river herring, shad, and straight bass research projects and served as staff lead in the development of fishery management plans for these species. Sarah has brought an in-depth knowledge of Mid-Atlantic fisheries to her role as a council member, and she has been a great asset to the council. Thank you, Sarah. Come on up, please.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments. It's been an honor and a privilege to serve on the council for 9 years. It's hard to believe it's almost been 9 years since I came to my first meeting. The first meeting was in downtown Manhattan. And I certainly am thankful to finish up on Long Island and Riverhead instead of being in Manhattan. But being on the council has allowed me to reconnect with a lot of people that I worked with over the years. They were a lot younger and so was I. First time I met Mike Louisi, we were going on a striped bass tagging cruise. Marty Gary was the same thing. And Greg DiDomenico was a young dude that came to Manio to go to work for the division. There are quite a few that sit around this table that also work for the division. But like I say, it's been an honor and a pleasure. This is a very hardworking, dedicated group who have made great strides and accomplished a lot. And I'd be very remiss if I didn't thank Chris Moore and his entire staff for their hard work and dedication. And I wish you all the best.
Our next award is going to go to Adam Nowalski. Adam is the appointed obligatory member from New Jersey since 2015. He's been chair and vice chair of Research Steering Committee, chair of Summer Flounder Black Sea Bass, chair of Collaborative Research, vice chair of Ecosystem and Ocean Planning, and also has served on 10 other committees from this council. Adam is always prepared. He shows up to the meeting, and I would not want to have to debate him because I would lose. Adam, thank you for your service. If you'd come on up. Speak here.
Actually, I'll take this public microphone. I guess I better get used to it here again. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who's believed in me over my time here, the public, people from the state of New Jersey, staff, everybody here around the table. My message to be with anybody is that anybody can do this. You know, I'm just a fisherman. There's a lot of us around the table and we think, wow, there's some federal process appointed by the Secretary of Commerce. And here I am doing it. And there's a number of additional people around the table in doing it. So I thank everybody, especially thank my family. I hope they're not listening into this, but my kids in particular, you know, I never had to come here. We've all give up time away from our families. But I'm just so thankful I've never had to worry about them being able to take care of things. And I'm truly appreciative for that. So thank you very much.
And we'd like to give one more recognition to, he's kind of an adopted son of this council, I guess. Chairman Reed is chairman of the New England Council. He's been here as long as I've been on this council. I've got to look at him at the end of the table. He's been chair of the Monkfish Committee. He's also served on the Mackerel, Squid, and Butterfish, River Herring and Shad, the demersal. And Eric, it's been a pleasure to get to know you. And we're going to miss you, but I'm sure we're still going to see you and still see Adam here around the table with commission stuff. So come on up.
I've been sitting here for 9 years on my ass. I'm gonna sit right here until I'm done. So I'm sorry. Well, you know, Sarah and Adam said all the appropriate things of thanking everybody. And I'd like to thank everybody as well. But, you know, I got here in a really unique way because when I interviewed for this job 9 years ago in New England, there in Rhode Island, they're like, well, you know, what do you want to be on a New England Council for? You don't go to the meetings. And I said, well, everything we catch in Rhode Island is managed by those people, you people. And I think they were a little surprised at my answer, but in any case, I've been here for 9 years. You know, Captain Bellavance has been helping me out doing this, and it's really been an honor to sit in this corner. And I really appreciate all the work that all of you have done. Dr. Moore and your staff, Mike, your staff, my staff in New England, Kate's staff in New England, not my staff, and the commission. And it's really been an honor. And of course, all of you people and all of you people. So you've all been comrades, confidants, coaches, and characters, all in your own right, and critics, which I appreciated more than anything because I always like to know how I can do better. I've had the opportunity to travel from places from Duck to Denmark because of the work of this council. And that was a real honor. And, you know, I really appreciate that. And I sincerely hope that my performance met all of your standards, because the last thing I would want to do is let any of you down. So thank you very much. Save my seat for the ASMFC joint meetings because I'm going to be back. So thank you.
Or with that, thank you very much, everyone. We'll see everybody back here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock and wrap things up and see some of you at dinner and some of you at hospitality.